In the dark of night, a young woman named May climbed into a pear tree, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She wasn't alone. Hidden in the shadows, her old blind husband January sat below, unaware of what was about to unfold. May's young lover, a handsome and clever man, was waiting for her in the branches. The air was thick with the scent of ripe fruit, and the thrill of forbidden love. This was not the first time May had met her lover in secret, but it was the most dangerous. If January were to discover their tryst, the consequences would be dire. May's story is just one of many that reflect the complex and often sympathetic portrayal of women in medieval literature. In a time when marriages were often arranged for political or economic reasons, young women like May found themselves married to much older men. These unions, more akin to business agreements than partnerships of love, left many women feeling trapped and unfulfilled. The literature of the Middle Ages, particularly the stories of courtly love and fabliaux, often captured these women's struggles and their quests for happiness and fulfillment, even if it meant breaking societal norms. One of the most famous examples of this is the fabliaux, a type of medieval short story that often featured humorous and sometimes bawdy scenarios. In these tales, young women married to older men would often seek love and passion elsewhere. The fabliaux Eunuch, by Marie de France, tells the story of a beautiful young woman locked in a tower by her elderly, jealous husband. She lived in sorrow, her beauty fading with each passing day. Her life was a prison, and she longed for love and freedom. One day, a mysterious knight appeared, and their love brought her back to life. The story suggests that a woman's desire for love and happiness is a natural and justifiable human need, even if it means being unfaithful to a husband who does not treat her well. Another genre that often portrayed women's struggles was the poetry of courtly love. This body of literature, primarily written by troubadours in southern France, celebrated the idea of a knight's love for a lady, often a married woman of higher social status. The poet's love was pure and noble, but it was also unrequited, as the lady was bound by her marriage. The poetry often expressed the pain and longing of the lover, as well as the lady's power and beauty. For example, in one poem, a knight declares his love for a lady he cannot have, saying, "In good faith, without deceit, I love the best and most beautiful. My heart sighs, my eyes weep, because I love her so much, and I suffer for it." This love was seen as a noble and selfless act, even if it was forbidden. However, some of the poetry also acknowledged the lady's right to choose and to pursue happiness, even if it meant being unfaithful. In a poem by a female poet, a woman expresses her desire for her lover, saying, "I'd like to hold my knight in my arms every evening, naked, for he be overjoyed were I only serving as his pillow, and he makes me more radiant than Floris's Blanchefleur." Here, the woman is not a passive object of the knight's desire, but an active participant in the relationship, seeking love and pleasure. The idea that women should be free to pursue love and happiness, even outside of marriage, was a controversial one in medieval society. While the literature often showed sympathy for women in such situations, the reality was far more complex. Adultery was not widely accepted, and the consequences for women who were caught could be severe. In the town of Agen in Aquitaine, for example, adulterers were punished by being marched through the streets naked, tied together at the genitals. This public shaming was meant to deter others from committing the same sin. Despite these harsh penalties, the literature of the Middle Ages often reflected a more nuanced view of women's desires and the societal constraints they faced. The stories of courtly love and fabliaux, while sometimes romanticized, offered a glimpse into the lives of women who dared to seek happiness in a world that often denied them that right. May's story, and the stories of countless other women like her, remind us that the human desire for love and fulfillment is a timeless one, and that the struggle for happiness has always been a part of the human experience. In medieval times, the rules for unmarried women were not as strict as those for married women. Among the aristocracy, a daughter's virginity was crucial for making a good marriage. Jewish and Muslim elites also guarded their unmarried daughters carefully. However, at other levels of Christian society, premarital sex, or simple fornication, between single men and women was fairly common. While it wasn't entirely accepted, it wasn't considered outrageous either. Court records from the late Middle Ages show that people were often fined for fornication, but the woman usually bore the brunt of the penalty. Despite the fines, Evidence suggests that women in late medieval France, and possibly other places, were not permanently shamed by having children out of wedlock, and could receive community support. In England during the High Middle Ages, villeinage unfree status included a fine called ledgerwhite or layerwhite. This fine was paid by an unmarried female serf who engaged in sexual activity, but the male partner was not fined. This could be because pregnancy was clear evidence of a woman's sexual activity, while it was harder to prove for men. The fine might have been meant to discourage the bearing of illegitimate children, who were a burden on the community. Another theory is that the fine reflected the idea that a female serf's fertility was the lord's property, and he needed compensation if it was used without permission. The lord might have seen the fine as a share of the profit from the serf's sexual activity, as medieval people often assumed women received gifts or payments in courtship. Layerwhite fines were levied in manorial courts, but church courts also fined people for fornication, with punishments often being similar for both men and women. Fornication was often seen as a prelude to marriage, especially among couples who intended to marry eventually. In early modern England, about 10 to 30% of brides were pregnant at the time of their marriage, suggesting that couples might have been waiting for pregnancy to force them into marriage. This pattern likely existed in the Middle Ages as well. In Southern Europe, where women married younger and were closely supervised by their families, the rates of premarital sex might have been lower, but there is still evidence of couples living together without marriage until they saw the need to formalize their relationship. In Venice, for example, couples at lower social levels often lived together without a formal marriage, especially when dowries or children were not a concern. If a man abandoned a woman and she sued for support, the authorities might prosecute for fornication to ensure that the relationship led to marriage. One case involved a woman who came to Venice under a promise of marriage, bore 5 children, and was later awarded support and a payment for her modesty, which was enough for her to marry as a non-virgin. Fornication was sometimes seen as a prelude to marriage, as indicated by the penalty of abjuration sub pena nubendi in English church courts. This meant that if a couple was caught fornicating, they would be made to promise future marriage, and if they had sex again, they would be considered married. The church's goal was to prevent concubinage or living together without marriage, rather than to prevent casual sex. In one notable case, Elisabetta Badoer, from a noble family in Venice, became involved with Perino Contarini, an illegitimate son of a leading family. He claimed they had secretly married, but her father had her examined and found her to be a virgin. Although Perino lost the court case, the fact that the highest court in Venice considered the case suggests that it was plausible for a noblewoman to take a lover before marriage. Wage workers, both urban and rural, were more likely to engage in premarital sex because they had more opportunities to meet and interact with potential partners. These women lived away from their families and had more freedom. In contrast, aristocratic women generally married younger and were more closely supervised. In Paris, women prosecuted in church courts for sexual offenses were often living outside their parents' homes, either as servants or in other capacities. Some of these cases involved ambiguous situations where one partner believed they were married, while the other did not. Medieval literature often reflects societal attitudes toward sex. For example, A Servant Girl's Holiday, a 15th century English poem, celebrates the sexual activity of a servant girl. The poem shows that non-marital sex among working-class women was seen as a normal part of life. Similarly, pastorals, 12th century French poems, often depict the seduction or rape of shepherdesses by aristocrats, suggesting that women's consent was not a significant concern in these narratives. Chaucer's Reeve's Tale provides another example. In this story, 2 clerks have sex with a miller's wife and daughter, as revenge for the miller cheating them. The women's consent is not considered, and the story treats their sexual involvement as a form of compensation. This indicates that the chastity of lower-class women was not highly valued by the upper classes. Enslaved women were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation. About 80% of the enslaved were women, and many were purchased for sexual service. In Muslim law, men could have sex with their enslaved women, and this was common. In Christian communities, the penalties for having sex with someone else's slave suggest that one could do so with one's own slave without consequences. Enslaved women were also vulnerable, because they often conducted daily business outside the home. While the chastity of lower-class women was not highly valued, the chastity of women from middling and elite families was crucial. In late 15th century Paris, accusations of deflowering were serious, often involving detailed testimony and discussions of dowries. A woman's virginity was seen as important for her marriage prospects. In southern Europe, a woman's chastity was closely tied to her family's honor, and the loss of virginity often required vengeance or a court verdict. Interfaith sexual relations were also strictly regulated. Marriages between members of different religions were not allowed, and all three religious groups, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, restricted the behavior of their women to prevent interfaith mingling. For example, Jewish women were not allowed to meet with non-Jewish men without witnesses, and Christian towns had severe penalties for interfaith sexual relations. Concubinage, or quays, imarital relationships, varied in different contexts. In the early Christian Middle Ages, concubinage was a recognized relationship, but by the Central and later Middle Ages, the term could mean different things. It could refer to a girlfriend or a woman a man slept with, and in some cases, the concubine of a single man might be a potential marriage partner. In Islamic societies, concubines were often enslaved and were seen as symbols of sexual pleasure. They could have a quays, a permanent relationship with their owner, and might gain status, especially if they bore a child. In medieval times, the relationships between men and women outside of marriage varied greatly depending on religious beliefs, social status, and cultural norms. While the practice of married men keeping concubines was more common among Muslims and Jews in Muslim regions, it wasn't entirely foreign to Christians. For instance, Margherita Dattini, the wife of a wealthy merchant in Prato, Italy, raised her husband's daughter from an enslaved woman as her own, even though the mother was never mentioned in their letters. A concubine in medieval times could refer to different types of relationships. Sometimes a concubine was a free woman who had a long-term sexual relationship with a married man, similar to what we might call a mistress today. One of the most famous examples is Catherine Swynford, who was the mistress of John of Gaunt, a powerful English noble. They had 4 children together, before eventually getting married after the death of John's second wife. Their children were later legitimized by the king, allowing them to inherit property but not the throne. This union eventually led to their great-grandson, Henry VII, ascending to the throne and founding the Tudor dynasty. In medieval towns, it was not uncommon for a man of higher social status to have a long-term relationship with a woman of lower status. These women, often called concubines, might live with the man until he married and then be provided for afterward. This arrangement could sometimes be a way for a woman to secure a better future, as in the case of a woman in Bologna, named Devisha. She accused a man named Xenos of promising to marry her, and then raping her. Xenos claimed he had only promised to take her as a concubine until they had children, after which he would seek his father's permission to marry her. The court case suggests that such arrangements were not entirely uncommon. For some, the term concubine might be misleading. In many cases, these women were more like unofficial wives, living in domestic partnerships with men who were unable to marry them due to various reasons. For example, in medieval Christianity, there was no divorce as we understand it today. If a couple separated, they were still bound by the marriage and could not remarry. A woman who separated from her husband and lived with another man would be considered an adulteress, while an unmarried woman living with a man who was separated from his wife would be more likely called a concubine. Church records and episcopal visitations often mention women referred to as concubines, but these women might have been in informal marriages. In some regions, like Catalonia, there was a recognized institution called barragania, which allowed couples to live together without formal marriage. This practice might have been more common among peasants, who often preferred other forms of union, or were not troubled by neighbors who did. One particularly vilified type of woman in medieval times was the priest's concubine. These women were often de facto wives, but the term concubine carried connotations of sexual immorality. Writers and preachers often blamed these women for corrupting priests and draining church resources. However, this portrayal was often a way for celibate men to deflect responsibility for their own desires and the natural human wish for a family life. One notable example of a priest's concubine is Beatrice de Planisoles from Montelou, France. She was a widow who became involved with the local priest, Pierre Clergue, who was actually a Cathar heretic. He convinced her that any sin, including sexual sin, was forgivable as long as one was received into the Cathar faith at death. Their relationship was frequent, and even involved sexual encounters in the church. Despite this, the Inquisition was more interested in her heretical beliefs than her sexual activities. Another famous case is that of Heloise and Peter Abelard. Heloise, a bright and educated woman, was the niece of a canon in Paris. Her uncle hired Abelard, a renowned theologian, to tutor her. Their relationship quickly turned romantic, and they began a passionate affair. Heloise later described how they used their lessons as a cover for their love, exchanging more kisses than concepts. Despite the power imbalance, Heloise never claimed to be coerced. She even refused to marry Abelard at first, arguing that marriage would tie him down and distract him from his scholarly pursuits. She preferred to be his concubine or mistress, believing it would allow their love to be freely given. After she became pregnant, they married secretly, but the relationship ended tragically when Heloise's uncle hired men to castrate Abelard. Both later took up monastic lives, and their correspondence provides a rare glimpse into the complex emotions and negotiations of medieval relationships. These stories highlight the varied and sometimes controversial nature of medieval relationships outside of marriage. They show that while the term concubine often had negative connotations, the reality of these relationships was often more nuanced, reflecting the complex social and personal dynamics of the time. In medieval times, the world of sex work was complex and often misunderstood. The term sex worker is used here to describe women who sold sexual services for money as a profession, distinguishing them from casual encounters that might have involved money but were not structured as a business. This distinction is important because it helps us understand the different roles and experiences of women in the Middle Ages. The Latin word meretrix and the Hebrew word zana were used to describe women who were sexually active outside of marriage, but these terms were broad and could include a wide range of behaviors. Some historians argue that using the term sex worker is anachronistic, as it carries modern connotations of labor and capitalism. However, the term prostitute is equally anachronistic, as it is often associated with negative stereotypes from the 19th and 20th centuries, such as disease, drug use, and trafficking. Medieval scholars and religious authorities had different views on sex work. Some saw sex workers as victims, while others viewed them as independent women making choices for economic reasons. In many cases, women turned to sex work because it was one of the few options available to them in a society where women's economic opportunities were severely limited. Wages for women were low, and they were often excluded from skilled trades. For some, sex work was a way to survive, even if it was socially degrading. The medieval church struggled to categorize sexually active women. There was no clear distinction between a sex worker and a loose woman. For example, the 14th century preacher's manual, Fasciculus Morum, defined fornication as intercourse with widows, whores, or concubines. If a woman was not a wife, virgin, widow, or concubine, she was often labeled a whore, whether or not she was a professional sex worker. Despite the moral condemnation, some medieval thinkers recognized the economic pressures that drove women to sex work. The legend of Saint Nicholas, who provided gold to a poor family to prevent the daughters from turning to sex work, acknowledges the economic realities of the time. However, the church generally did not accept economic need as an excuse for sex work, even if it made the sin more understandable. The working conditions of sex workers varied. Many towns in Europe had official brothels, which were sometimes privately run but licensed by local authorities. These brothels often had regulations to protect the women, but they also imposed strict rules. For example, women were often forbidden from having lovers outside of their customers and were confined to the brothel. Some historians argue that these conditions were similar to those in carceral spaces. Not all sex workers operated in formal brothels. Many worked in less structured settings, such as taverns, bathhouses, or private homes. Some shared houses or rented rooms from landlords. Bathhouses, in particular, were often places where couples, including sex workers, could meet in private. The role of sex workers in medieval society was complex. Many municipal authorities saw them as a necessary evil, providing an outlet for male lust to prevent greater sins. Ptolemy of Leuca famously compared sex workers to the bilge in a ship or the sewer in a palace, suggesting that they prevented the corruption of respectable women. However, this attitude did not necessarily translate to respect for the women themselves. In multicultural regions, sex workers often served as markers of community boundaries. In Christian Iberia, for example, there were strict laws against sexual relations between Christians and non-Christians. Jewish or Muslim men who had sex with Christian women could face the death penalty, though enforcement was inconsistent. Despite the moral condemnation, sex workers sometimes refused to have sex with non-Christians and reported such encounters to the authorities. Literary depictions of sex workers were often more nuanced than the official stance. They could be portrayed as enjoyable partners, and they might be part of social networks within towns. In one London case, a sex worker provided information about potential marriage partners, helping women avoid unsuitable matches. This suggests that sex workers were sometimes seen as part of the community, even if they were not fully respected. Despite the moral and social stigma, sex workers were sometimes called upon as expert witnesses in legal proceedings. In cases of impotence, for example, sex workers might be asked to determine whether a man was impotent with all women or just with his wife. This role indicates that, despite their low social status, sex workers were sometimes trusted with important tasks. The world of medieval sex work was a complex interplay of economic necessity, social stigma, and cultural norms. While sex workers faced significant challenges, their experiences and roles in society were more varied and nuanced than the official narratives suggest. The discussion of contraception in the Middle Ages often focuses on its use by married couples, but it's likely that unmarried women, especially sex workers, also used methods to prevent pregnancy. Many of these women were uneducated and couldn't read medical books, but they probably shared knowledge about contraception through word of mouth. Medieval medical texts sometimes mention the low pregnancy rates among sex workers, but they attributed this to frequent intercourse making the womb less fertile or to infections, rather than to the use of contraception. One of the most common methods to avoid pregnancy was coitus interruptus, or pulling out before ejaculation. However, this was considered sinful by the Church. Other methods like oral, anal, or manual sex were rarely discussed in texts, even though they were likely known and practiced. The Church and other authorities did not often write about these practices, treating them as unmentionable sins. Women who never married, whether by choice or circumstance, made up a significant portion of the medieval population. Some of these women might have had same-sex relationships, but the historical record is very limited. Medieval sources often focused on men's behavior, and women's activities were only noted if they affected men. There was no specific term for women who loved other women, and the evidence for such relationships is sparse. Some love poems and shared burials suggest the existence of these relationships, but it's hard to know how common they were. Medical texts from the time had little to say about women having sex with other women. When they did, it was often to explain it as a result of physical abnormalities or to prescribe penance. The few court records that exist show that women were rarely prosecuted for same-sex behavior, partly because medieval law viewed sex as requiring penetration, which was not possible between women without the use of an artificial phallus. Some medieval texts, like Etienne de Fouger's Livre des Manières, portrayed sex between women as ridiculous because it lacked a phallus, but also acknowledged that the women involved were satisfied with their relationships. When women were accused of same-sex behavior, it was often because they were seen as taking on a male role, using an artificial phallus or dressing as men. This could be a way for hostile sources to describe someone who identified as a man, adding another layer of complexity to the historical record. In literature, women sometimes dressed as men to gain access to male-only institutions or to travel safely. These stories reflect real-life situations where women might have adopted male identities for practical reasons. The limited evidence we have suggests that medieval women, whether they were sex workers, unmarried, or in same-sex relationships, had complex lives, and made choices that were often overlooked or misunderstood by the society around them.